The explosion came from nowhere. Lieutenant Cara Merrick felt the heat before she heard the sound. 800 meters above the valley floor, perched on a granite outcrop that served as her nest for the past 6 hours, she had exactly 1.3 seconds to register the orange bloom of flame that erupted from the rocks 15 meters to her left. The RPG's overpressure wave hit her like a freight train. Her 13 Malawian Quach's sniper rifle flew from her hands as her body became airborne, spinning through the Afghan night like a discarded rag doll. The world became a kaleidoscope of stars, rock, and fire. Her integrated combat system screamed warnings into her earpiece that her brain couldn't process. The granite face of the mountain rose up to meet her, and then there was nothing but black. At forward operating base Lionheart, 42 kilometers to the south, a technician monitoring biometric feeds watched a single line go flat. "Ghost is down," he announced, his voice cracking. Vitals are negative. 0 heartbeat. 0 respiration. Commander Marcus Webb stood behind him, arms crossed, face carved from stone. He watched the flat line for exactly 4 seconds before turning to his communications officer. "Confirm the kill," he said quietly. "Sir, we should send." "I said confirm the kill, Lieutenant." Webb's voice carried the weight of 23 years in naval special warfare. That ridge took a direct hit from an RPG-7. At that altitude, with that terrain, there's no surviving the fall. Logged the time of death as 0 to 47 hours. "We're not risking more operators on a recovery that won't recover anything." The communications officer swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Webb turned and walked toward the Tactical Operations Center, his boots echoing against the plywood floor. He didn't look back at the flat line still tracing its way across monitor. 42 kilometers north, lying in a pile of shattered limestone 300 meters below her observation point, Lieutenant Cara Merrick's heart had stopped beating. For 47 seconds, she was clinically dead. And then, in the cold Afghan darkness, surrounded by enemies who would kill her on sight, something happened that no one in that Tactical Operations Center would ever forget. Her heart started again. If that opening hooked you, trust me, this story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage, and hit that notification bell. Now, let me show you how Cara became the woman they called Ghost, and why her own commander wanted her dead. 3 months earlier, Cara Merrick had been the best-kept secret in naval special warfare. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, with shoulders that belied her lean frame and hands that could field strip in 13 Malawian Quachas in under 60 seconds or thread a needle at 800 meters. Her call sign, Ghost, hadn't been assigned by accident. It came from her 3rd deployment, when she had crawled 17 kilometers through Helmand Province over 4 days to eliminate a high-value target that 3 previous operations had failed to reach. The target's guards never saw her, never heard her, never knew she existed until the single 300 Winchester Magnum round punched through his skull at 740 meters. She had exfiltrated the same way she'd entered. Invisible, untouchable, a ghost. SEAL Team 7 had recruited her personally. Commander Marcus Webb had flown to Dam Neck to observe her final qualifying exercises, and what he saw had convinced him that conventional warfare thinking couldn't explain her abilities. She didn't just shoot well. She became part of the environment, reading wind patterns that other snipers couldn't feel, sensing movement that registered below conscious perception. "She's either the best sniper I've ever seen," Webb had told his executive officer, "or she's something else entirely." He'd signed her transfer papers that same day. For 18 months, Cara had served as SEAL Team 7's primary designated marksman. She deployed to Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, accumulating a service record that would have made her legendary if such records weren't classified at the highest levels. 47 confirmed kills, 0 mission failures, a reputation among the community's operators as the person you wanted watching your back when everything went sideways. But it was her most recent deployment that had changed everything. The Panjshir Valley operation had been Webb's brainchild. Intelligence suggested that a Russian arms dealer named Colonel Dmitry Valkov was moving surface-to-air missiles through the region, weapons that would eventually find their way into the hands of insurgent groups across 3 continents. The mission was straightforward. Identify Valkov's distribution network, document his contacts, eliminate him if the opportunity presented itself. What Cara didn't know as she prepared for that mission, was that Commander Marcus Webb had already been in contact with Valkov for 8 months. Through encrypted channels routed through servers in Moldova and Cyprus, Webb had been selling operational intelligence to the Russian colonel, safehouse locations, patrol schedules, extraction routes, the identities of Afghan interpreters working with American forces. Each piece of information had a price tag, and Webb had been collecting $400,000 through a web of shell companies that would have made a Wall Street accountant impressed. The arrangement had worked perfectly until Kara Merrick began asking questions. 3 weeks before the Pancha deployment, she had noticed irregularities in the pre-mission intelligence briefings, details that didn't match the satellite imagery, timelines that seemed too convenient, enemy force estimates that contradicted signals intelligence from other units in the region. She had brought her concerns to Webb personally. Standing in his office at FOB Lionheart, surrounded by maps and photographs of men they were hunting, she had laid out her observations with the same methodical precision she applied to long-range shooting. "Sir, these numbers don't add up," she had said, spreading 3 intelligence reports across his desk. "The patrol frequency we're being told to expect contradicts everything I'm seeing from National Geospatial. And this timeline for Valkov's movements, it's almost like someone gave him advance warning of our surveillance windows." Webb had listened with apparent interest, nodding at appropriate intervals, asking clarifying questions that suggested he took her concerns seriously. Inside, his blood had turned to ice. "You're right to bring this to me, Lieutenant," he had said smoothly. "I'll have the intelligence section review the discrepancies. In the meantime, I want you to document everything you found. Keep it between us until we know what we're dealing with. Could be sloppy analysis. Could be something more concerning." Kara had nodded, grateful that her commanding officer had taken her seriously. She hadn't realized that she had just signed her own death warrant. That night, Webb had sent an encrypted message through his usual channels. A single sentence that would set everything in motion. "The sniper is asking questions. Handle it." Valkov's response had arrived within the hour. "Understood. Make sure she's isolated on the next operation. We'll take care of the rest." And so the Panjshir Valley mission had been designed not to eliminate a Russian arms dealer, but to eliminate the one person who might expose Webb's treason. The RPG that had struck Kara's position hadn't been random enemy fire. It had been precisely targeted, coordinated through Russian military frequencies, and timed to coincide with the moment when SEAL Team 7's assault force was fully committed to their ground objective and unable to provide support. Webb had chosen to position himself during the mission briefing. "Ghost, you'll establish Overwatch here," he had said, pointing to the granite outcrop on the topographical map, 800 meters above the valley floor. "Perfect sight lines to the compound. You'll have eyes on everything." What he hadn't mentioned was that the position was also perfectly visible from a ridgeline 400 meters to the east, a ridgeline that Valkov's security team had occupied 12 hours before the operation began. The ambush had been textbook. Now, lying in the darkness with blood seeping from 3 broken ribs and a knee that had twisted so badly during the fall that the medial collateral ligament had partially torn, Kara Merrick didn't know any of this. All she knew was pain and silence. Her communication system had been destroyed in the fall. The integrated combat module that monitored her vitals and transmitted them back to headquarters was crushed somewhere beneath her body. Its antenna snapped, its circuits fried by the same impact that stopped her heart. But Kara's heart was beating now, 47 beats per minute. Slow, steady, the heart of someone whose body had learned to conserve energy through years of training for exactly this kind of nightmare scenario. She opened her eyes and saw stars. Not hallucinations. Actual stars. The Afghan sky above her was crystalline and beautiful, a tapestry of light pollution that would never exist over any American city. She lay on her back, staring up at constellations that her instructors had taught her to use for navigation, and she tried to remember how she had gotten here. The explosion, the fall, the impact that had driven every molecule of air from her lungs and stopped her heart with the simple physics of kinetic energy transferred to organic tissue. She should be dead. The fact that she wasn't meant either God had plans for her or her body possessed survival capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters. Kara wasn't particularly religious, so she settled on the second explanation. Her hands moved first, then her arms. She conducted a systematic assessment of her injuries the way she'd been trained, starting with her extremities and working inward. Left hand, functional, bruised but not broken. Right hand, pain in the wrist, possible hairline fracture, but the fingers worked. Left arm, operational. Right arm, deep laceration along the tricep, bleeding but not arterially. She could feel the warm wetness soaking through her sleeve. Legs. This was where the assessment began to break down. Her left leg responded normally, bruised from knee to hip but structurally intact. Her right knee, however, sent lightning bolts of agony through her nervous system when she tried to bend it. Torn ligament, grade 2 at minimum. She had experienced the same injury during BUD/S training, had pushed through it for 3 weeks before the medical staff had finally noticed her limping and pulled her from exercises. She could still walk, probably for short distances, with improvised bracing. Torso, 3 points of sharp, localized pain along her left side. Broken ribs, at least 3, possibly 4. And beneath that, a deeper sensation that she recognized with cold clinical detachment. Punctured lung, not fully collapsed, or she would already be dead, but compromised. Every breath was becoming a negotiation between her body's need for oxygen and the damaged tissue's capacity to deliver it. She had hours, not days, before that lung became a serious problem. Okay, she whispered to herself. Okay, Ghost, you're alive. Now stay that way. She rolled onto her stomach, ignoring the screaming protests from her ribs, and began the process of taking inventory of what she had left. Her 13 Malawian kwaches was gone, lost somewhere on the mountainside during her tumble down 300 meters of Afghan granite. Her tactical vest was shredded but still attached, and when she checked the pouches, she found her Sig Sauer P2 .26 pistol still secured in its holster. The magazine held 15 rounds, plus 1 in the chamber. 16 chances to stay alive. Her night vision goggles were cracked but functional. The left eyepiece was completely destroyed, but the right one still displayed the green-tinted world she had learned to navigate over a decade of special operations. Water, 2 liters in the Camelbach reservoir on her back, somehow intact despite the fall. Medical supplies, a small individual first aid kit, designed for self-treatment of penetrating trauma. Gauze, compression bandages, a single dose of morphine that she was saving for when the pain became truly unbearable. No food, no communications, no way to signal her position, and she was 42 kilometers behind enemy lines. Cara Merrick lay in the darkness and did the math that would determine whether she lived or died. 42 kilometers, 26 miles. At her current physical condition, with a torn knee, broken ribs, and a punctured lung, she might be able to cover 5 kilometers per day if she traveled only at night and rested during daylight hours. 8 days minimum to reach friendly lines. She had water for perhaps 2 days. The equation didn't balance. But equations had never stopped Cara Merrick before. She forced herself to her feet, biting down on her own sleeve to prevent the scream that wanted to escape from her throat. The world tilted dangerously, and she grabbed the nearest rock formation to steady herself. Stars exploded across her vision, then faded. She was standing. 1 step at a time, she said quietly. Just 1 step at a time. She began to move. Behind her, the distant sounds of gunfire echoed through the valley. SEAL Team 7 was still engaged with Valkov security forces at the compound, unaware that their sniper had been targeted, unaware that their commanding officer had orchestrated the entire operation to eliminate a threat to his financial arrangements. They thought she was dead. Commander Webb had made sure of that. At that very moment, 42 kilometers south, Webb was standing in the Tactical Operations Center, watching the assault unfold on multiple screens. The mission was going according to plan. His operators were moving through Valkov's compound, eliminating resistance, gathering intelligence. Intelligence that Webb would ensure never reached analysts who might connect Valkov to his own communications. He had been careful, meticulous. For 8 months, he had played both sides with the precision of a man who had spent his entire career understanding operational security. Cara Merrick had been his only mistake. She had seen patterns where others saw noise. She had asked questions that cut too close to uncomfortable truths. And she had done so with the same quiet competence that made her lethal behind a rifle. Webb had recognized the threat immediately. The woman who could hit targets at 800 meters could also hit the truth at close range. Given enough time, enough access, she would have unraveled everything. His contact with Valkov, the shell companies, the $400,000 sitting in accounts across 3 countries. So she had to go. The RPG strike had been elegant, a coordinated ambush that would appear to be nothing more than enemy action during a routine operation. No investigation, no questions, just another operator lost in the endless war, her memory honored and her death mourned but never examined too closely. Webb had attended a dozen memorial services for fallen SEALs over his career. He knew exactly how they worked. The flag-draped coffin, the speeches about sacrifice and duty, the 21-gun salute that never failed to bring tears to the eyes of those left behind. Kara Merrick would receive the same treatment, and then Commander Marcus Webb would continue his profitable relationship with Russian intelligence without interference. He smiled slightly as he watched his operators breach the final room of Valkov's compound. Objective secured, the assault team leader announced over the radio. No sign of primary target. Valkov wasn't here. Webb's smile didn't waver. Understood. Gather all intelligence materials and prepare for extraction. We'll analyze what we have and adjust our approach. Of course Valkov wasn't there. Webb had made sure of that too. The Russian colonel was currently positioned on a ridgeline 400 meters from where the RPG had been launched, observing the aftermath through thermal optics. He had watched the strike detonate exactly where his men had aimed it. He had watched the body of the American sniper tumble down the mountainside, disappearing into the rocks below. No one survived that fall. He lowered his binoculars and turned to the security chief. It's done. Contact our friend at the American base. Confirm the elimination. The message reached Webb's personal device 7 minutes later, routed through the same encrypted channels they had used for 8 months. Package delivered. Threat neutralized. Payment as discussed. Webb read the message once, then deleted it. Another $50,000 would appear in his Cyprus account within the week. The price of a human life, calculated and paid with the same efficiency as any other business transaction. He felt nothing. The woman had been a threat to his operation. Now she wasn't. War had casualties. This was simply one more. What Commander Marcus Webb didn't know, as he congratulated himself on the successful elimination of his only problem, was that Lieutenant Kara Merrick was currently crawling through Afghan scrubland with collapsed lung and a burning determination that would become legendary in the special operations community. She was not dead, and she was coming for him. But first, she had to survive. The first night was the worst. Kara moved through darkness that seemed absolute, her single-functioning night vision optic painting the world in shades of green that made distance and depth difficult to judge. Every step with her right leg sent fresh waves of agony through her torn knee. Every breath was a calculation of how much air she could draw before her damaged lung protested. She covered 4 kilometers before dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, 4 kilometers in 7 hours. At this rate, she would reach friendly lines sometime around her 45th birthday. She found a shallow cave beneath a limestone overhang and crawled inside, arranging her body so that the morning sun wouldn't illuminate her position. The temperature was already rising, and by midday, the rocks around her would be hot enough to burn exposed skin. Water. She needed to conserve water. She allowed herself 3 sips from her camelbach, feeling the liquid slide down her throat like liquid gold. Then she forced herself to stop. 2 liters. 8 days of travel. The math didn't work unless she found water somewhere along the route. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by pain and the constant awareness that she was alone in enemy territory, without communications, without support, without anyone knowing she was alive. At one point, she dreamed of the moment the RPG struck. In the dream, she could see the shooter, a figure silhouetted against the Afghan sky, holding the launcher at his shoulder, waiting for the exact moment when she was most exposed. But when the figure turned toward her, the face beneath the helmet wasn't Afghan. It was Commander Marcus Webb. Kara woke with her hand already wrapped around the grip of her Sig Sauer, her heart hammering against her broken ribs. Just a dream. But even as she told herself this, some part of her mind was already assembling the pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. The intelligence discrepancies she had noticed before the mission, Webb's unusual interest in her concerns. The positioning of her Overwatch site exposed that eastern ridgeline in a way that no tactical analysis should have permitted. The precision of the RPG strike, fired at the exact moment when she was most vulnerable. No, she pushed the thoughts away. Webb was her commanding officer. He had recruited her personally, had trusted her with missions that lesser commanders would never have authorized. The idea that he had orchestrated her death was paranoid thinking, the kind of conspiracy theorizing that exhausted, injured minds produce when they couldn't process reality. She was injured and alone. That was enough to deal with. She didn't need to add imaginary betrayals to her list of problems. But the dream stayed with her. Day 2 brought new challenges. Her knee had swollen overnight to nearly twice its normal size, the damaged ligament screaming with every movement. She used strips of fabric torn from her tactical vest to create an improvised brace, wrapping the joint tightly enough to provide support without cutting off circulation. The result was ugly but functional. She could walk. Barely. Her lung was another matter. The puncture wasn't healing. She could feel fluid accumulating in her chest, compressing the damaged tissue, making each breath shallower than the last. Without proper medical treatment, she had perhaps 4 days before respiratory failure became inevitable. 4 days. 36 kilometers still to cover. 9 kilometers per day. Impossible. Kara Merrick had never believed in impossible. She waited until sunset, then began moving again. The terrain here was marginally easier than the rocky mountainside where she had started, rolling hills covered with scrub brush that provided concealment. She used the North Star to maintain her bearing, checking her position against the topographical features she had memorized during mission planning. The compound where Valkov had been hiding was 7 kilometers to her west. SEAL Team 7 would have extracted hours ago, taking whatever intelligence they had gathered back to FOB Lionheart for analysis. She was alone out here, truly alone. Around midnight, she heard voices. Kara dropped flat immediately, ignoring the protests from her ribs, and lay motionless in the Afghan darkness. The voices were speaking Dari, the local language, and they were getting closer. She counted 5 distinct speakers. Men, based on the vocal register. Armed, almost certainly. Whether they were Taliban, local militia, or simply villagers who happened to be traveling at night, she couldn't determine. What she could determine was that she couldn't outrun them, not with a torn knee and a punctured lung. The voices grew louder. She could hear footsteps now, crunching against a gravel path that ran 30 meters to her right. They were moving parallel to her position, heading southwest toward one of the villages marked on her mental map. Just keep walking, she thought. Just keep walking and don't look over here. The footsteps stopped. One of the voices said something sharp, questioning. Another responded. There was a brief conversation that Kara couldn't follow, and then a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. They had seen something. Her blood trail. Kara had been bleeding steadily from the laceration on her arm, leaving drops of crimson that would be invisible in darkness but suddenly obvious when illuminated. She hadn't thought to bandage it more thoroughly, hadn't realized she was leaving a trail that even amateur trackers could follow. Stupid, careless, potentially fatal. The flashlight beam swept toward her position. She had seconds to decide. Run and almost certainly be caught. Fight and almost certainly die. Hide and hope they somehow missed her. Kara chose option 4. She rose from concealment, drew her Sig Sauer, and aimed at the nearest figure's center mass. Stop, she said in Dari, one of the few phrases she knew. Stop or I kill. The 5 men froze. For a long moment, no one moved. The flashlight remained pointed at the ground between them, casting strange shadows across faces that Kara could barely see. She kept her pistol steady, finger resting alongside the trigger guard, waiting. Then one of the men laughed. American, he said, the word heavily accented but recognizable. American woman. Alone. He said something to companions in rapid Dari. More laughter. The sound was cruel, anticipatory. They were not impressed by her weapon. They saw what she was. Injured, exhausted, outnumbered, easy prey. Kara adjusted her aim slightly. Her finger moved to the trigger. I have 16 rounds, she said, switching to English since her Dari was exhausted. 5 of you. Anyone want to do that math? The man who had laughed took a step forward. Kara shot him in the leg. The report of the Sig Sauer was thunderous in the night air. The man went down screaming, clutching his thigh where a 9mm round had punched through his quadriceps muscle. Blood began pooling beneath him immediately. The other 4 men scattered. Kara didn't pursue. She didn't have the energy, and she didn't have the ammunition to spare. Instead, she turned and moved as quickly as her damaged body would allow, putting distance between herself and the wounded man whose screams would soon bring others. 15 rounds now, and everyone in the valley had just learned that an American was out here somewhere. Her extraction route had just become significantly more dangerous. She traveled until dawn, covering another 8 kilometers through sheer force of will. Her knee had stopped sending pain signals entirely, which was not a good sign. Either the nerve endings had been damaged beyond function, or her body was beginning to shut down non-essential systems. Either way, she was running out of time. The cave she found for her second day of hiding was smaller than the first, barely large enough to contain her body in a fetal position. She wedged herself inside, pulled branches across the entrance, and allowed herself to close her eyes. Sleep came immediately, and with it, the dream returned. Webb's face, the RPG streaking toward her position, the fall that should have killed her. But this time, the dream showed her something new, a conversation. Webb standing in his office at FOB Lionheart, speaking into a satellite phone, his voice low, urgent, the words unclear, but the tone unmistakable. He was afraid. He was making arrangements. And the name he kept repeating over and over was hers. Merrick, Lieutenant Merrick, the sniper. She's asking questions. Kara woke with the sun directly overhead and the absolute certainty that her commanding officer had tried to kill her. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was pattern recognition. The same cognitive process that allowed her to read wind patterns and calculate bullet trajectories was now assembling the evidence of Webb's betrayal. The intelligence discrepancies, his unusual reaction to her concerns, the positioning of her overwatch site, the precision of the ambush. No enemy patrol had fired that RPG. It had been coordinated, planned, executed with the kind of information that only someone with access to mission planning could have provided. Webb had sold her position to the enemy. Webb had arranged her death. And now Webb was back at FOB Lionheart, probably attending her memorial service, probably speaking eloquent words about sacrifice and duty, while her blood was still drying on Afghan rocks. The realization should have broken her. Instead, it forged her into something harder than she had been before. Survival was no longer enough. Justice was now the objective. She needed proof, evidence that would hold up under investigation. Something more than the intuitions and pattern recognition of an injured operator whose word could be dismissed as trauma-induced paranoia. And she knew exactly where to find it. Colonel Dmitry Valkov, the Russian arms dealer who had been the target of the Pancher operation. The man who had coordinated with Webb to arrange her assassination. The man who, according to the intelligence briefing she had memorized, maintained a safe house 17 kilometers northwest of her current position. If she could reach Valkov, she could extract the truth. And if she could bring Valkov back alive, she would have proof that no one could ignore. It was a terrible plan. Reckless. Almost certainly suicidal. She was injured, alone, outgunned, and outnumbered in every possible way. But Lieutenant Kara Merrick had never let terrible odds stop her before. She began moving at sunset, altering her bearing from due south to northwest. Every step was agony. Every breath was a battle. But with each kilometer she covered, her determination solidified into something approaching destiny. She would find Valkov. She would make him talk. And then she would drag him back to friendly lines and watch Commander Marcus Webb's world collapse around him. Day 3 brought her to within visual range of Valkov's safe house. The compound was smaller than she had expected. A collection of 4 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, surrounded by a 3-meter wall constructed from local stone. From her position, on a hillside 600 meters to the south, she could observe the entire facility through her damaged night vision optic. 8 guards visible, rotating shifts of 4, with the second team sleeping during daylight hours. 2 vehicles in the courtyard, a technical with a mounted machine gun, and a civilian SUV that looked European in design. And there, moving between buildings just after sunset, a man whose face she recognized from the intelligence photographs. Colonel Dmitry Valkov, silver-haired, approximately 60 years old, moving with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. Kara watched him for 3 hours, mapping his patterns, noting his routines, calculating the vulnerabilities in his security arrangements. The guard were competent, but not exceptional. They conducted their patrols at predictable intervals, checked their perimeters at predictable times, and demonstrated the kind of comfortable complacency that came from operating in an area they believed was safe. They didn't know a wounded American sniper was watching them from 600 meters away. They didn't know that the sniper had 13 rounds left and absolutely nothing to lose. Around midnight, Valkov emerged from the main building and walked toward the SUV. 2 guards accompanied him, but their attention was focused outward, watching for external threats. They weren't expecting an attack from a single operator who should have been dead 3 days ago. Kara moved. Her knees screamed with every step, but she had gone beyond pain now. Her body was operating on reserves she hadn't known she possessed, fueled by adrenaline and rage and the cold certainty that she would either achieve her objective or die trying. She reached the compound wall without being detected. The wall was 3 meters high, unscalable with her injuries, but there was a drainage channel at the base, carved into the earth to redirect rainwater away from the foundations. It was narrow, barely wide enough to accommodate her shoulders, and filled with the accumulated debris of years of neglect. Kara went through it anyway. The pain was extraordinary. Her broken ribs scraped against stone. Her damaged lung protested every compressed breath. But inch by inch, she forced herself through the channel until she emerged inside the compound, covered in mud and blood and barely conscious. She had made it. Now came the hard part. Valkov was standing beside his SUV, speaking to one of his guards in rapid Russian. Kara understood enough of the language to recognize he was discussing a departure. He was leaving the safe house. Tonight, if she didn't act now, she would lose him forever. She rose from the shadows like the ghost they had named her, her Sig Sauer tracking toward the nearest guard's skull. The first shot was perfect. 300 milliseconds. Target acquisition. Trigger squeeze. The guard's head snapped back as 9mm hollow point ammunition entered his brain, dropping him before he could raise an alarm. The second guard was already turning, already reaching for his weapon, already opening his mouth to shout a warning. Kara's second shot caught him in the throat. He went down gurgling, clutching the wound that would kill him in approximately 90 seconds, his shout reduced to a wet, gurgling sound that carried no further than the courtyard. 11 rounds remaining. Valkov was running. The Russian colonel had spent 3 decades surviving in the world's most dangerous regions. His instincts were sharp, his reactions faster than a man his age should possess. He was already halfway to the main building's door when Kara's third shot struck the frame inches from his head. "Stop," she commanded, or "the next one goes through your spine." Valkov froze. Slowly, carefully, he turned to face her. What he saw should not have been possible. A woman covered in blood and mud, standing on a leg that was clearly damaged beyond normal function, aiming a pistol with hands that should have been shaking but were as steady as granite. "Lieutenant Merrick," he said, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "I was told you were dead. Your information was incomplete, so it would seem." Valkov's eyes moved, assessing, calculating. "You're injured. Badly. You cannot possibly make it to friendly lines in your condition. Why not simply accept the inevitable?" "Because I'm not the only one who's going to die tonight," Kara said. "Unless you give me exactly what I want." "And what do you want, Lieutenant?" "Commander Marcus Webb. I want proof of his treason. I want evidence that will hold up in a military tribunal. And you're going to provide it." Valkov was silent for a moment. Then, remarkably, he laughed. "You're asking me to betray a business partner? To provide evidence that will destroy him and, in the process, expose my own operations? Why would I do such a thing? Because if you don't, I'll kill you right now and find the evidence myself. You could try." Valkov's voice was cold. "But there are 6 more guards in this compound. They've heard the shots. They're coming. You have perhaps 30 seconds before you're surrounded by men with automatic weapons and absolutely no reason to keep you alive." Kara smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. 30 seconds is more than I need." She moved forward, closing the distance between them with speed that her injuries should have made impossible. Before Valkov could react, she had the muzzle of her Sig Sauer pressed against his temple and her arm wrapped around his throat. "Call them off," she said quietly. "Tell them it was a false alarm. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. But if a single one of them comes through that door with a weapon raised, you die first." Valkov's composure cracked for the first time. He could feel her arm trembling against his throat. He could feel the blood from her wounds soaking through his expensive shirt. He could feel the absolute certainty in her grip that told him she would do exactly what she promised. "Stoy it," he shouted in Russian. "VSE normalno. Voзвrashkazy and Nasvoy Pasti." The footsteps that had been approaching stopped. Voices called out questions. Valkov answered them with the same authority that had built his arms-dealing empire, and eventually, reluctantly, the guards withdrew. Kara didn't release her grip. "Now," she said, "we're going to take a walk. You're going to show me everything. Every communication with Webb. Every payment. Every piece of evidence you have. And then we're going to travel 40 kilometers to the nearest American base, where you're going to repeat everything to investigators. That's suicide. For both of us. Maybe, but at least I'll have the satisfaction of knowing Webb goes down too." Valkov was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Calculating. "What if I offered you an alternative?" "Not interested." "You haven't heard it yet." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Commander Webb is valuable to my organization, but not irreplaceable. And your survival complicates matters significantly. If the Americans learn that Webb's intelligence led to the attempted assassination of one of their own operators, the investigation will eventually trace back to me. So perhaps we can reach an arrangement that serves both our interests. I give you the evidence you need. All of it. Communications, financial records, operational details. Enough to destroy Webb completely. In exchange, you forget where you obtained it. You tell your investigators that you found materials during your escape recovered from dead enemies. You never mention this compound or my name." Kara considered the offer. It was pragmatic, ruthless in its simplicity. Exactly the kind of deal that a man like Valkov would propose. "No," she said. Valkov's eyebrows rose. "No. You coordinated with Webb to kill me. You're responsible for the deaths of every Afghan interpreter whose identity Webb sold you. You've been arming insurgents who have killed American service members. You don't get to walk away from that. Then we are at an impasse." "No, we're not." Kara's arm tightened around his throat. "You're coming with me, willingly or drugged into unconsciousness. That's your choice. But you're coming. I won't survive the journey. Then I'll carry your corpse. At least that way the forensic evidence will still be admissible." For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Valkov's face. He had dealt with dangerous people throughout his career. Warlords, intelligence officers, terrorists, politicians. He understood the calculus of violence better than most men alive. But he had never encountered anyone quite like Lieutenant Merrick. "You're insane," he said quietly. "Probably. But I'm also your only chance of surviving the next 60 seconds. Make your choice." Valkov made his choice. 3 hours later, they were 5 kilometers from the safe house, moving through mountain terrain that tested every limit of Kara's damaged body. Valkov's hands were bound behind his back with strips of fabric torn from his own shirt, and a gag prevented him from calling for help. She had recovered an AK-47 from one of the dead guards, along with 4 magazines of ammunition. The weapon was balanced across her shoulders, within easy reach if they encountered resistance. She had also recovered something far more valuable. In a hidden safe beneath Valkov's bed, she had found a laptop computer containing 8 months of encrypted communications. Bank records showing transfers to accounts that trace back to Commander Marcus Webb. Operational intelligence files that Webb had provided, complete with the timestamps and digital signatures that would prove their authenticity. Everything she needed. Now she just had to survive long enough to deliver it. Dawn found them sheltered in a rocky ravine, with Kara positioned at the entrance and Valkov secured to a boulder 10 meters inside. She hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours. Her lung was failing. Her knee had swollen to the point where she could no longer bend at all. But she was still alive, and she was still moving. "You won't make it," Valkov said, having worked the gag loose during the night. 25 kilometers still to cover. "Look at yourself. You're dying. Keep talking and I'll gag you again. I'm simply stating facts." Your body is shutting down. I can see it in your color, your breathing, the way you're favoring your left side more with each passing hour. You have perhaps 18 hours before systemic organ failure begins. Kara looked at him steadily. Then I'll move faster. That night, she covered another 12 kilometers. Valkov proved surprisingly cooperative once he understood that resistance would only slow their progress and increase the likelihood of encountering enemy patrols. He walked when told, stopped when told, and maintained silence except when Kara asked him direct questions. She asked many questions. How long has Webb been working with you? 8 months. We were introduced through an intermediary in Moldova. What did he sell you? Everything. Patrol schedules, safe house locations, informant identities, operational timelines. He was remarkably thorough. How much did you pay him? For $100,000, distributed through a network of shell companies. He was quite particular about the financial security. A careful man, your Commander Webb. Kara processed this information with the same detachment she applied to calculating wind drift at 800 meters. Webb's betrayal was no longer a personal injury to be mourned. It was intelligence to be analyzed, evidence to be documented, crimes to be prosecuted. She had moved beyond anger. What remained was purpose. Why did he want me dead specifically? Valkov's eyes met hers. You were asking questions, noticing discrepancies in the intelligence he was providing. He became concerned that you would eventually identify the source of the leaks. So he sold my position to your people. More than that, he specifically designed a mission to isolate you on that ridge, chose a location himself during mission planning, provided us with the exact coordinates and timing. The RPG team had been in position for 12 hours before your operation began. Kara nodded slowly. And the other SEALs? My team. They were never in danger. Webb couldn't risk multiple casualties without triggering a serious investigation. A single sniper lost enemy fire during a complex operation. That's unfortunate, but not suspicious. Multiple deaths would have required explanations he couldn't provide. The clinical logic of it was almost impressive. Webb had calculated everything. The risk, the reward, the optimal method of eliminating his problem without creating new ones. He had applied the same tactical thinking to murdering her that he would have applied to any other operational challenge. She had been nothing more than a variable to be eliminated. What happens when we reach the American base? Valkov asked. You go into custody. I go to medical. And Webb goes to prison. And my organization? That's not my problem. Valkov was silent for a moment. You know they'll never let this go public. The embarrassment would be too significant. A decorated SEAL commander selling intelligence to Russian arms dealers? They'll classify everything, bury the evidence. Handle it quietly. Maybe, but Webb will still spend the rest of his life in Leavenworth. That's enough for me. Is it? Truly? After everything you've survived, everything you've sacrificed, simple imprisonment is sufficient justice. Kara stopped walking. She turned to face the Russian colonel, her damaged night vision optic painting his face in shades of green. Let me tell you something about justice, she said quietly. 3 days ago, I died on an Afghan mountainside. My heart stopped. My lungs collapsed. I should have been nothing but meat cooling in the rocks. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But I came back. I dragged myself out of that darkness because somewhere in the universe, there's a balance that needed to be maintained. Webb tried to murder me for money, for financial security, for a retirement account that would let him live comfortably in some beachfront property, while the men and women he betrayed rotted in the ground. Her eyes locked onto Valkov's. So yes, imprisonment is sufficient, because Webb is going to spend the rest of his life knowing that I survived, that I found him, that every day he wakes up in a cell, it's because the woman he tried to kill refused to stay dead. She paused. That's justice, and it's more than he deserves. They reached the edge of friendly territory at sunset on day 7. Kara was barely conscious by then. Her lung had partially collapsed again during the final push, and only sheer willpower was keeping her upright. Valkov walked beside her now, no longer bound, having surrendered completely to the inevitable outcome of their journey. The first person to spot them was a 19-year-old Army private named Thompson, stationed at an observation post 3 kilometers outside forward operating base Murphy. He would later describe what he saw in terms that became legendary within the special operations community. She came out of the mountains like something from a nightmare, covered in blood, barely able to walk, dragging this older guy behind her. I thought she was a ghost at first. Actually thought I was hallucinating. And then she looked at me with these eyes that were just completely empty, and she said, "I'm Lieutenant Carr Merrick, SEAL Team 7. This man is a Russian intelligence asset with evidence of treason against the United States. Take us to your commanding officer." Thompson had done exactly that. Within the hour, Carr was in surgery at the base medical facility, and Colonel Dmitry Valkov was in the custody of military intelligence officers who understood immediately the significance of what he represented. Word reached Commander Marcus Webb at FOB Lionheart approximately 3 hours later. The message was simple. Lieutenant Carr Merrick had survived. She had captured Colonel Dmitry Valkov. She had evidence. Webb received the news in his office, alone, with the door locked. According to the investigation that followed, he sat motionless for approximately 6 minutes after reading the report. Then he placed his service pistol on the desk in front of him and stared at it for another 4 minutes. In the end, he didn't use it. Perhaps he lacked the courage. Perhaps he calculated that suicide would be interpreted as an admission of guilt. Perhaps some part of him still believed he could talk his way out of the situation the way he had talked his way out of so many others. Whatever the reason, when the military police arrived at his door 18 minutes later, Webb surrendered without resistance. His court-martial began 6 weeks later at Naval Station Norfolk. The proceedings lasted 3 days. The evidence against Commander Marcus Webb was comprehensive and irrefutable. Valkov's testimony, corroborated by the communications and financial records recovered from a safe house, established beyond any reasonable doubt that Webb had been selling classified intelligence to Russian interests for 8 months. The evidence also established that Webb had deliberately positioned Lieutenant Merrick on the ridge where she was ambushed, had provided the exact coordinates and timing to Valkov security forces, and had intentionally declared her dead before any rescue operation could be mounted. Webb's defense attorneys argued that their client had been coerced. They argued that Valkov was an unreliable witness with obvious incentives to deflect blame. They argued that the digital evidence could have been fabricated. But they couldn't argue with Lieutenant Carr Merrick. She took the stand on the second day of the trial, still walking with cane, still bearing the visible scars of her ordeal. Her testimony was delivered with the same quiet precision she had applied to eliminating targets at 800 meters. No emotion, no drama, just facts. "Commander Webb chose my position for the operation," she said. "He specifically selected that ridge despite my concerns about its exposure to the eastern terrain. When I was struck by the RPG and my vitals flatlined, he immediately declared me dead without authorizing any recovery operation. He could have sent assets. The assault team was 12 minutes away. Instead, he logged my time of death and continued the mission." She paused, her eyes finding webs across the courtroom. "I crawled out of those mountains with 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, a torn ligament, and a gunshot wound I acquired on day 4. I traveled 42 kilometers through enemy territory in 7 days. I captured a Russian intelligence asset and recovered evidence of treason against the United States." Her voice dropped slightly. "Commander Webb left me to die because I was inconvenient, because I asked questions, because I threatened his arrangement with Colonel Valkov. He betrayed every principle of the special operations community, every oath he ever took, every man and woman who ever served under his command." She leaned forward. "He deserves to spend the rest of his life remembering what that betrayal cost him." The jury deliberated for 97 minutes. Commander Marcus Webb was found guilty on all charges. Life imprisonment at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, reduction in rank to E1. Webb received the verdict without visible reaction. He was escorted from the courtroom in chains, his naval career destroyed, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about what happens when personal greed overcomes institutional loyalty. He would spend the next 43 years in that prison, dying at the age of 78 without ever having been visited by anyone from his former life. Kara watched him go. She felt nothing that could be described as satisfaction, nothing resembling triumph. The man who had tried to murder her was going to prison, and yet the cost of that justice had been measured in blood and pain and the permanent destruction of SEAL Team 7. The team was disbanded 3 months after court-martial. Too many operators had served under Webb's command without recognizing his treason. Too many missions had been compromised by his intelligence sharing. The institutional damage was too severe to repair through leadership changes alone. Kara's former teammates scattered to other units, their careers forever marked by association with the worst treason scandal in naval special warfare history. She mourned for them. They had been her brothers and sisters. They had fought beside her, bled beside her, carried her through moments when she had doubted her own strength. And now they were paying the price for a betrayal that none of them had committed. But she also understood that some wounds cannot be healed through denial. SEAL Team 7 had been corrupted at its core. The only path forward was through the wreckage, not around it. 2 years after the court-martial, Lieutenant Kara Merrick was promoted to lieutenant commander and given command of Task Force Cerberus. It was a new unit, built from the ground up with operators handpicked for their integrity as much as their capabilities. Kara personally interviewed every candidate, looking for the same qualities that had once made SEAL Team 7 legendary before Webb's corruption had poisoned everything. Loyalty, courage, sacrifice, but also accountability. The founding principle of Task Force Cerberus was simple, carved into a plaque that hung above the operations center door. We bring everyone home, not just the operators, not just the assets. Everyone. The principle applied to extraction operations and intelligence gathering, to training exercises and real-world deployments. It applied to the wounded and the dying, to the captured and the abandoned. It applied, most importantly, to the truth. Kara had learned in the mountains of Afghanistan that the greatest betrayals come not from enemies, but from those we trust. She had learned that silence in the face of corruption is itself a form of corruption. And she had learned that survival without accountability is merely postponement of inevitable collapse. Task Force Cerberus would be different. Under her command, operators were encouraged to question intelligence, to challenge operational assumptions, to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. The culture she built was one where integrity was valued as highly as capability, where doing the right thing mattered as much as achieving the objective. It was, in many ways, the opposite of everything Commander Marcus Webb had represented. And it worked. Over the next decade, Task Force Cerberus became legendary in the special operations community. They achieved mission success rates that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. They developed innovative tactics that were studied and adopted by units across all service branches. They built a reputation for bringing everyone home, every time, no matter the cost. Kara's call sign evolved during those years. She was still Ghost, but now the name carried a different meaning. She wasn't called Ghost because she was invisible, silent, impossible to detect. She was called Ghost because she had returned from death itself, because she had crawled out of an Afghan grave and dragged evidence of treason 42 kilometers through enemy territory, because she had refused to stay dead when everyone expected her to, because she had proven that some people simply cannot be killed, no matter how hard others try. The woman who should have died on that mountain ridge had instead become something more than human in the eyes of those who knew her story. A legend, a symbol, a ghost who haunted the nightmares of anyone who considered betraying the people who trusted them. And every morning, as the sun rose over whatever base she happened to be stationed at, Lieutenant Commander Kara Merrick would pause for a moment and remember. She remembered the explosion. She remembered the fall. She remembered the moment she had woken up alone in the Afghan darkness, abandoned and broken and given up for dead. And she remembered the choice she had made in that moment. Not to die, to survive, to drag herself out of the wreckage and make those who had betrayed her answer for their crimes. That choice had defined everything that followed. It defined who she became. It defined Task Force Cerberus. It defined the new standard of loyalty and accountability that spread throughout the special operations community in the years after Webb's conviction. One woman, broken and abandoned, had changed everything. And in the end, that was the real lesson of Kara Merrick's story. Not that betrayal is punished, not that justice is served, but that the measure of a warrior is not found in their victories or their capabilities or their service records. It is found in what they choose to do when everything has been taken from them, when they have been left for dead by the people they trusted, when survival itself seems impossible. That is when true character reveals itself. And Lieutenant Commander Kara Merrick, call sign Ghost, had revealed hers on an Afghan mountainside, crawling through darkness toward a justice that no one else believed was possible. She had returned from death, carrying a silver-haired Russian commander, and the world had learned that some ghosts cannot be killed. Some ghosts come back,